Hey guys, welcome back. Nathan, aka Absurd Being, back with Kierkegaard. Metaphysics Part 2 is what we're looking at today. And so there's quite a bit to cover, but yeah, that's how we do it, right? We cover stuff. So we're going to look at being and non-being, in particular the way that becoming works, or how becoming fits into that picture. We'll also look at possibility, necessity, and the negative and positive, which was all on the title page when you came in. So let's get to that diagram and just see where we are going today. So if you have a look on the left side there, at the top, under the opposites, in the opposites section, there are the next four that I've grouped together: non-being versus being, possibility versus actuality, freedom versus necessity, and the negative versus the positive. Those are the four we're looking at today. I've grouped them together because, I mean, Kierkegaard doesn't do this, obviously, but it's just, they all seem to share a lot in common. And as I was planning these, what I was going to say, they all of these topics, all of these opposites, they overlap quite a bit. So I thought it was best to just hit them all in one go. And if you follow the arrow down, you can see underneath the metaphysics section there of the diagram, there's possibility, non-being, actuality, and being, and then in the middle there is our becoming. And this is basically what we're going to look at today. So let's make a start with being, non-being, and becoming. All right, so let's get into it. Basically what I'm going to do with this section is just work through a long quote from Philosophical Crumbs, page 141 if you're interested, if you're following along. And he talks. It's an interlude in that book, and he asks the question: is the past more necessary than the future? And it's in this section that he gets into this whole idea of becoming and what becoming is. And that's our first question: what is becoming? How can we describe becoming? And I'll start with a quote. All other change presupposes that the thing that undergoes the change exists. Such is not the case with becoming, because if the thing that comes into existence does not remain unchanged in the change of becoming, then the thing that comes into existence is not this becoming, but another. So let's just have a quick look at that and break this down. There are a couple of things. The first thing I want to mention is, notice that the words change there, they have two different meanings. I've highlighted that with the square brackets, and that's because Kierkegaard actually uses a Greek words in place of change. But when they're translated as change. But the first one means transformation, and the second one there you can see means motion or disturbance. So we're talking about slightly different things, even though the word in English is the same, and that's an important distinction. So let's see what this is. All other change presupposes that the thing that undergoes the change exists. So the idea here is that the thing that exists, i.e. the thing that we are talking about, is what undergoes the change in regular, when we're normally talking about change. When something changes, you have something to start with, and it's that thing that will change, that undergoes the transformation. So you could think about this as like A changing into A prime. That's kind of the way that I thought about it. So there's a transformation, there's a change happening, the prime, but the thing that changes is that original A, and it changes into A prime. However, if we keep going, such is not the case with becoming, because if the thing that comes into existence does not remain unchanged in the motion of becoming. So rather than using the word change here is quite misleading, because it's not actual change, it's becoming. He's talking about the movement of becoming. And so it's important to bear that distinction in mind. If the thing that comes into existence does not remain unchanged in their motion of becoming, then the thing that comes into existence is not this becoming, but another. So the change of becoming is different from a regular change. And it's different because the thing that becomes must remain unchanged throughout the process, must not transform into something different. Because if the thing transforms, the thing that we start with, the thing that existed, if that transforms into something different, then we don't have the becoming of that original thing. We just have the original thing changing or transforming into something different. But we don't have any... so what we get at the back end of that process, the A prime, is different from the A. It's not different in essence. I mean, it's still an A, but it's no longer the same A that we started with. And the movement, the motion of becoming, Kierkegaard's pointing out here, is that whatever it is that becomes can't transform during that process. We want the same thing before and after becoming, or else we're talking about the becoming of something different. So if you think about the A to A prime, like I said, A prime is different from A. Same essence, but it's different. It's transformed. Becoming is not like this. If A was to become, as opposed to change, then the post-change, is that too confusing? The post-change entity must also be A. So there's an A which becomes, and it becomes A at the other side. Otherwise, A doesn't become anything. A transforms into A prime or something different. Becoming, the bottom line with this, I think, is that becoming is not a transformation. Becoming is not a change from one thing into something different, even though the essence might be the same. And he gives a really perfect example of this in the book, and it's an example of a plan. So you can imagine a plan. You know, you've worked out a plan of how you're going to attack something, how you're going to do something, and you go about and execute it. If, however, the plan has changes in some way in the execution while you're carrying out the plan, then it's not the original plan anymore, right? You don't execute the original plan. The original plan has been changed, so now you're executing a different plan. And that's the idea that Kierkegaard's getting at here. Whatever becomes must be the same before and after the becoming, like a plan. If the plan remains the same, then we can say this plan has been executed, right? But if we change the plan in some way, then it's no longer this plan which is executed. It's a different plan, and that would be change. That would be transformation. So then we can ask, well, if a plan is realized, is executed exactly as it was intended to be, what's changed? What's happened? Nothing, right? I mean, nothing has changed, but we'll find out shortly that, in fact, we'll find out right now that this change is, even though it's nothing, it's still, in a sense, something. And the answer Kierkegaard gives to that question is this change is not in essence, but in being. It is a change from non-being to being. Before, the plan only existed on paper. It was, in your mind, it was an idea, and afterwards it exists as an event, as a real, concrete, actual event. So that's what's changed regarding this plan. The plan itself hasn't changed, but its mode of being, if you like, has changed. And it's gone from non-being to being. Non-actual to actual. Non-concrete to concrete. So that is the change of becoming. And I just want to drill in a little bit more and look at this idea of non-being becoming being. And the way I'm going to do that is with this quote, and we'll just break this down. But this non-being, which the thing that comes to be leaves behind, must also have some sort of being. Otherwise, that which comes to be would not remain unchanged in this coming to be. Every change always presupposes a something, but the sort of being that is nevertheless non-being is precisely possibility, and a being that is being is precisely actual being, or actuality, and the change of becoming is thus the transition from possibility to actuality. So I just want to break this down a little bit, go through the quote while it's there on the screen, before I read through my notes. So let's have a look at this. This non-being which the thing that comes to be leaves behind must also have some sort of being. Otherwise, that which comes to be would not remain unchanged in this coming to be. So we've got non-being. Non-being becomes being. That's the plan example. But non-being here can't mean absolutely nothing. It can't mean like void, or it's not an absolute nothing. It has to be something. It has to have some sort of being. We've called it non-being because it's the opposite of the actual event being realized. So it's non-being in that sense that it's not real, it's not actual, but it has to have some kind of being. It must be, in some sense, something, or else there is no change at all. There could be no becoming in the first place. And that's the very next part of that quote. Every change always presupposes a something. So there must be something there. But what Kierkegaard's saying is that something is a non-being. And that sort of being that is nevertheless non-being is precisely possibility. And if you remember yesterday for me, I don't know when I'm publishing these videos, but the last video we talked about non-being as possibility, and that's what we're coming back to here. Non-being, the sort of being, the sort of thing that is non-being is possibility, and a being that is being is precisely actual being or actuality. So that the difference here then between non-being and being is that difference between the possible and the actual. So the change of becoming is a transition from possibility to actuality. Okay. So I think that's that. One thing I would add to that is just remind you of the analogy I drew last video when we were talking about how nothing can be something, how a non-being can still have some kind of being. And at that time I talked about a hole in the ground, which even though it is literally non-ground, it's literally nothing, no thing, you still avoid it. You're still aware of it. You still know it's there, and you still make an effort to avoid it and not fall in. And in that sense, it is something, even though it's clearly non-ground, nothing. So that's what Kierkegaard's getting at here. And in a way, you can see like this non-being. When he says non-being, what he's actually saying is non-concrete, non-actual, and then the opposite, then being, is actual, is concrete, something. And that if you have not, or if you've read Sartre, you'll notice that is an idea which is basically at the root of Sartre's thought. This distinction between non-being and being, which he carries over into the distinction between the for itself and the in itself. So that is non-being and being, and that's becoming. The kind of being that is non-being is possibility. The kind of being that is being is actuality. Yep, done. So just one last point. Kierkegaard says that all becoming is a suffering, and it's the suffering of actuality, in which possibility is annihilated by actuality. So it's an interesting way to put it. All becoming is a suffering. There's obvious religious overtones there, but that will become more important or more relevant, or you'll see more why Kierkegaard phrases it like that in this video, but a little bit later. This idea of becoming being suffering or kind of bad in some way, and we'll get to that shortly. But I do just want to head back to the diagram and just to, now that we've discussed this, I think the diagram will make a little bit more sense. So again, if you look down the bottom left, underneath metaphysics, we have that the two, possibility and non-being at the top, and underneath that, actuality and being. So those are the two kind of extremes. And then becoming is the change, although I use that word with some reservations, the change that occurs between the two, from non-being to being. All right, so that's becoming. And the next thing I want to look at, and this will be a brief section, I think, is on necessity. Okay, so necessity, and this will also touch on freedom. So the first thing, what the traditional position here is that the necessary is the unity of the possible and the actual. So whatever could have happened and actually does happen was considered or thought to be necessary, that it had to have happened. And when I say it out loud now, it doesn't really make sense, right? Just because something could have happened and did happen doesn't mean that it must have happened. It had to happen. But that is the traditional position that Kierkegaard was disputing here, but the way he does it is interesting, and he builds on that distinction there in the last section between non-being and being and becoming. So necessity cannot come to be. That's the first point. Becoming it's a change of sorts, but the necessary cannot be changed. There can't be any becoming involved in the necessary. And if you think about it, it may seem a little bit of a stretch to get to it first, but if you think about it, the necessary when we're talking about becoming, we're talking about a change from non-being to being, from possibility to actuality. And the necessary, to be necessary in the first place, really it can never be possible, because by definition the possible may not become, right? Just because something's possible doesn't mean that it will happen. And so, but on the other side, the necessary never admits of that uncertainty, right? The necessary must happen. It's absolutely certain that it will. So it can't undergo this change of becoming, which involves going from possibility to actuality. Rather, Kierkegaard says, the necessary is. It just is. It doesn't admit of this change from non-being to being, from possibility to actuality. So he says, necessity is not a determination of being, but of essence, in that it is the essence of the necessary to be. So that's interesting, and it's an interesting way of putting it, I think, and this was really the beginning of this whole idea in existentialism of being and non-being and essence and these kinds of things. But let's just look at this. Necessity is not a determination of being, but of essence, in that it is the essence of the necessary to be. So it has nothing to do with being, with non-being or being. Rather, it's about what makes the thing what it is, its essence. And it's the essence of the necessary to be, to exist. So it never has this non-being or possibility, or even the being or the actuality. This whole discussion doesn't occur when we're talking about necessity. It just is. So therefore, being completely different in essence from possibility and actuality, necessity cannot be their unity, cannot be the blend of the two. Because as we saw, possibility and actuality, they were difference. Their difference was on turned on their being. Possibility was non-being. Actuality was being. But necessity, the essence of necessity, is to be. Okay, I think I'm overdoing that. Let's keep going. I've got one more quote on this, and this will bring in the notion of freedom. So let me get to that. The change of becoming, we've seen, has nothing to do with necessity. The change of becoming is actuality. The transition takes place with freedom. All becoming occurs freely, not necessarily. Nothing that becomes comes to be from a logical ground, but everything because of a cause. Every cause terminates in a freely acting cause. The illusion created by the intervening causes is that the becoming appears necessary. Their truth is that, as having themselves come to be, they definitively point back to a freely acting cause. So this is cool. We get the link back to freedom, which you remember from the last video is not something we have, it's something we are. We are freedom. So the change of becoming is actuality. Cool. The transition takes place with freedom. All becoming occurs freely, not necessarily. Nothing that becomes comes to be from a logical ground, but because of a cause. So there's no... If it was logical, if it came from a logical consequence or from a logical reasoning, something like a mathematical proof, then we're talking about the necessary. Then it just is. Then we're not talking about the change of becoming. But what we're talking about here, the change of becoming, comes to be because of a cause, not because there's a logical proof behind it. There's a kind of a step-by-step logical, evidential kind of ineluctable chain of events, which means that the becoming must happen. That's not how becoming works. Becoming becomes because of a cause, and every cause terminates in a freely acting cause. So this is the idea is that every cause, if you trace it back far enough, you'll eventually get to a freely acting cause, a freedom, which is us. And that's, interestingly enough, that's what Heidegger says too. Exactly the same thing. If you trace everything back, you eventually get to a Dasein, who's performing or carrying out the action with a goal in mind. But Kierkegaard goes on to say that there's an illusion created by all of the intervening causes, and the illusion is that this becoming appears necessary. We can look back and see this led to that, which led to this, which led to the next thing, and that creates this illusion that it had to happen that way, that this was necessary, that it wasn't the change of becoming. But the truth is, as having themselves come to be, they point back to a freely acting cause, us. And that is necessity and freedom. The next section we're going to look at, I'm going to look at possibility and actuality in a bit more detail. All right, so possibility versus actuality. So possibility and actuality are not different in essence, but they're different in being. I'm just recapping what we've covered. The former, possibility, is non-being, and the latter, actuality, is being. So that's how they differ. Their essence is the same though, and their shared essence, is becoming. That's what unites them. Remember, we saw in that last section that the difference between those two, their essence is becoming, and the essence of necessity, on the other hand, is to be. The essence of the necessary is to be. The essence of possibility and actuality is to become. So that's just a reminder of that. Ethically, Kierkegaard talks about the actual being higher than the possibility. Being higher than the possible. And what he means by this is that the possible is kind of disinterested, in a sense. It's not engaged, right? Only things that are actual. And this is perhaps the central theme in Kierkegaard, the focus on existence, existing things, reality, actuality, the concrete, as opposed to the abstract or the possible. He is all about existence, what exists, actuality. So the possible for him is disinterested, it's disengaged, it's not, it's perhaps interesting to think about in a metaphysical kind of way, but it's not real. It doesn't concern human beings. Human beings' principal concern should be their existence. They exist. We exist. So that should be what we're initially, at least, and mostly concerned about, is that existence, that actual existence. So in that sense, ethically, the actual is higher than the possible. And he talks about the way that Descartes' cogito ergo sum is kind of the extreme of this possible, the extreme version. It's the possible taken to the extreme, because the cogito is not I. It's not any I. It has no specific, particular, concrete reference. It's just everyone. The cogito is general. It's not my consciousness. It's everybody's consciousness, or it's consciousness in general. It's anyone's consciousness. So that's ethically the cogito for Kierkegaard is has absolutely no relevance, because it's just a general kind of, it is a philosophical, speculative concept, rather than something real and tangible that should concern us, and that we are real, tangible human beings. We are existing. So that's an interesting point, which we will revisit very soon as well. And the other point, which I have stolen from Concluding Unscientific Postscript, is that actuality is only found in the individual themselves. And what I mean by that, or what Kierkegaard means by that, is that you can't find actuality by talking about other people or by looking at other people. If you want actuality, if you want to know actuality, you have to go inside, because actuality is not something we can see from outside. It's something we live. It's something, it's the existing thing. And again, that is what Kierkegaard boils down to, this inward focus. And for him, as he's talking about actuality, which is so crucial, and it's the only thing that has ethical value, is only found within you. Not within people, not within human beings, but within you and within me. And only I can find it in me. Right? I can't find it anywhere else. I have to look within. So that is absolutely crucial to Kierkegaard. The next thing I want to look at is this leap as well, because that's important here. The last video we talked about the self, when the self becomes, so the becoming of the self, and how that was a qualitative leap. That was a leap that is not, it doesn't, we don't build up to it. It's not, we don't get to that, to the next stage in increments. It's something that it just, we're at the lower stage, and then without traversing the intervening space, we're immediately at that higher stage. And that's the same thing here with this movement from possibility to actuality, or becoming. Becoming is a qualitative leap. It's not something that happens gradually, steadily, and you do this and you follow these steps and then you achieve. And that's not the way this works. And we talked about that in relation to anxiety. And it's worth revisiting because it's applicable here. We talked about the way that it should appear as if this leap from the possible to the actual should nullify anxiety, right? Because anxiety is precisely anxious about nothing. It's anxious about possibility. So if we get rid of possibility and we have a relation of actuality, then we should have dispensed with that. But this was not the case, and it wasn't the case because, if you remember, the phrase was, the new actuality is an unwarranted actuality. I like that phrase because it doesn't produce that absolute permanent actuality which is free from possibility. Possibility is always a part of any actuality, of any actual human situation. It's, no matter how hard you try to lock it in, to be certain, to be complete, there's always possibility. It's just part of the nature of what it is to be human. And that's my point here, that possibility cannot be eliminated from human existence. And that ties in, it's kind of the flip side of what I said in the last video, that anxiety cannot be eliminated from human existence. And so I've got the diagram I'm just going to show you now is it's basically the same diagram which is in the on the overall picture of Kierkegaard that I showed at the beginning of the video, but I've just done it again. Basically, you can see going from possibility or non-being through becoming to actuality and being, but there's also an arrow going back from that actuality to possibility, and that's to capture this idea that in human existence, in a real lived life, we can never escape this possibility. It's always there. And so I want to talk about the possibility being, or possibility and non-being being bad in a sense, in a Kierkegaardian sense. I know bad is not, it's not a good word, and I really struggle to come up with a good word. The word I want is negative. He treats possibility and non-being in a very negative, he sees them as negative, and the opposite, actuality and being are good. But I don't want to use negative because we're talking about non-being and negation. I don't want to confuse things, so I'm just going to stick with bad. So even though it sounds, it's like a 10-year-old, just it's very simple language. But anyway, possibility is bad for Kierkegaard. Why? It always has these, well, I've done it here, negative connotations. And it's interesting because this is the opposite of Sartre and Heidegger in particular. But they both talk about possibility as as something at least neutral. It's something that our possibles are, they make up our horizon, our future horizon. We can strive towards these things. We can project ourselves towards various possibilities, and really in those two thinkers, I think possibility is a positive thing. It's a good thing. But for Kierkegaard, it doesn't have that connotation. And the reason, well, first of all, as we've seen, possibility is the source of anxiety. It's non-being. It's this. It creates that tension for us, for human existence. And he goes on to say that possibility, if we think of it correctly, we tend to think of the possible as good, right? Many things we can do, the more options you have, the better. But possibility, if thought correctly, is not just the happy and joyful, but it's the terrifying and horrific as well. And once one grasps this, and when he has thoroughly learned that every anxiety for which he feels alarm can come upon him the very next instant, then he will give actuality another explanation. He will praise actuality, and even when it lies heavily upon him, he will remember that it is still far, far lighter than possibility had been. And that's pretty much encapsulates everything I'm trying to say here. We tend to value possibility, but when we realize that actuality, what's tangible, what's real, what's lived in our lives, even if it may not be exactly how we want it, it's worth far more than those possibilities, because those possibilities aren't limited to just the positives, aren't limited to the what might go well, what might go right in the future. By definition, it carries with those good things, those good possibilities, the terrifying ones as well. And just to reinforce this theme, in Stages on Life's Way, he has a little anecdote called a possibility, and in that story, there's a guy who he finds himself kind of tortured by this possibility, this idea that perhaps he had fathered a child without realizing it. Well, I mean, he realized it when he was doing it, but he the mother had never told him, that she was pregnant or that she had a child, and he never saw her again. He didn't even know her name or anything. So he was tortured by this possibility that he was a father, and eventually that possibility, even though it's only possibility, that eventually drove him crazy. And so that's really, like I say, that's a little parable-like thing from Stages, and just drives home this idea of Kierkegaard. He's really allergic to possibility. He's all about the actual. And so that brings me to the last section, or not the second to last section actually, positive and negative. All right, so we're going to turn now to positive and negative, the positive and the negative. Now, this doesn't just mean the good and the bad. We're talking about existence, and positive, as Kierkegaard uses it particularly in concluding Unscientific Postscript, positive is, he uses the word being, but he doesn't mean actuality. He doesn't mean the way that we talked about it before, possibility versus actuality, non-being, being. That this, the positive when we're talking about existence here is complete. So if something is positive, it's finished, it's whole, and completed, as opposed to the negative, which is becoming. And not so much becoming in the sense that we talked about it before, but becoming in the sense that it's incomplete, it's not finished. And so that's the distinction that we're making here between the positive and negative. Positive is, and in a way, it's very close to the way that Sartre uses these terms. Positive describes being in itself, which is complete. It is what it is, and that doesn't admit of any possibility or negation. It just is. As opposed to the negative, which is non-being, which is the for itself, which is always, by virtue of what it is, by definition of the for itself, it's always in motion. It's constantly dynamic, because it's never complete. It's never fixed in its being. It always has that negation built into it, and that's the similar kind of thing that the Kierkegaard's getting at. Positive is complete, negative is becoming, incomplete. And he talks about this. So like I said, we're talking about existence, the existing subject. The existing subject as existing cannot be, but only be constantly arriving. And this is good for Kierkegaard. So the negative is, again, I use the word good because I don't want to confuse the issue, but the negative is good in the sense that that is what we are as existing individuals, as existing subjects. We are never complete. We're never finished. Our lives are never finished when we're living them, obviously, right? So it's good. When I say it's good, I mean it's what we are, and it's the way that we have to. It's the way that we ought to think. It's the way that we have to structure our our lives around this truth that we are always becoming. We're never complete. Because if we were complete, if we were positive in the Kierkegaardian sense of the word, we'd be finished. Our lives would be finished. They'd be done. We could step back from it. It's a completed life. We could step back from it, look at it, and then we could analyze it. Then we could go to work on it with logic and science and all those things. But because our lives are not complete, they're negative in the Kierkegaardian sense, we have to think about ourselves as existing subjects, not as completed projects which we can now reflect on and analyze and go to work with our philosophical or scientific theories. That's not what we are. We're still becoming. We're never complete. So I've got a quote here to capture some of this, the idea that we're constantly striving, and how Kierkegaard talks about the negative. That the existing subjective thinker is constantly striving does not, however, mean that he has a goal in the finite sense towards which he strives, and reaching would mean he was finished. No, he strives infinitely, is constantly coming to be, which is ensured by his being constantly just as negative as positive. So again, the idea there, positive is complete, finished, it's being, negative is unfinished and becoming. And just to drill it in, drill it home, if it wasn't clear, it's not about achieving projects. It's not about setting yourself goals, which you can then complete, because obviously once you complete a goal, you're still existing. You still exist. You're still an existing subject, an existing individual, and you can partition off, I guess, that goal that you've achieved, and you can reflect on it and look at it and see what worked and what didn't, and however else you want to analyze it. But you can never do that same thing with your life, and that is what one of the things that Kierkegaard constantly rails against, particularly with Hegel. Right, he attacks Hegel all the time because that's what Hegel does. He wants to analyze philosophically human existence. He wants to step back from it as if he's not in the middle of it himself, and Kierkegaard constantly takes him to task for that. Okay, so it's the same thing with proofs. The more, and the quote I have is this: the more positively the proof is produced, the less it proves, for then the longing will be for something experienced, the content of which must be assumed to be essentially exhaustive, inasmuch as it is experienced. The more negative the proof, the better it is, for the negative is higher than the positive, is the infinite, and thus the one and only positive. So again, don't get confused with what we were talking about before with possibility and actuality, and how I see Kierkegaard as kind of afraid of possibility. This is a different. We're talking about something quite different here. Whenever we come up with a proof, the more positively, the more concretely, the more certain that proof is, the more the tighter our reasoning, our logic, the less it proves, because human existence is never something complete that we can apply these kind of rigorous logical models to. It's something that's always experienced, always lived, never complete. Just because how can a human life be complete when you're living it? So the more negative the proof, the better it is, for the negative is higher than the positive. So that's this idea that it's higher than the positive in the sense that we are negative. We are constantly striving. We're constantly becoming. Right? Our lives are never over. I feel like I've said that a lot, but and it's not really that complicated a concept, yeah. So let me leave that. And the very last section I want to hit you with is about being, where Kierkegaard talks about it in kind of in the way that Heidegger uses the word. So we know that, well, if you've read Heidegger, you know that for Heidegger, being means slightly a different way from thinking about it than Kierkegaard thus far, and certainly from Sartre. But so being for Heidegger is that which makes beings appear, that by which beings can appear as beings. So he's really trying to get to that essential question, and he talks about it as being hidden, and yet obviously it's profoundly important. It's the only thing that is important and that matters for Heidegger. It's what his entire philosophical life was based on. And there's one section in Stages on Life's Way where the author, William Ephraim, talks about himself as pure being in this Heideggerian sense. And I thought it was interesting, and I'll just give you the quote. "I am pure being, and thus almost less than nothing. I am the pure being that is everywhere present, but yet not noticeable, for I am continually being annulled." And he goes on to talk about his nothingness, the way that he is absolutely nothing, despite the fact that he's publishing the manuscript. He's publishing this manuscript, but he has nothing to do with it. He's like in the background, hidden, and kind of the reason for the manuscript being published in the first place, but he has nothing to do with it. He didn't produce it. He didn't write anything in the manuscript. It's all written by someone else. And so I thought that was really interesting to see that connection there, because that is definitely the way that Heidegger sees being. And it has nothing to do with anything we've talked about so far, about non-being and being and actuality. But it just cropped up, caught my eye, and I thought I'd let you know about it. So let's get to our summary. Okay, so we looked at becoming, and the way that this is a change in being, not in essence, and it's a change from non-being to being. Also was important, all becoming occurs in freedom. So we could always trace back, we could always work back through causes, but we'd always come back to a free agent, a free cause, which is the human being. Necessity, we looked at necessity and saw that this was a determination of essence, not of being. The essence of necessity is to be, and this meant that it has nothing to do with possibility and actuality. So it's kind of an interesting refutation of determinism, I guess. Then we looked at possibility and actuality, and the way that basically these are non-being and being. And we saw how, for Kierkegaard, possibility has this kind of negative association, this negative connotation, is not good. And actuality, on the other hand, was positive, was good, was something that he focused on. And slightly confusingly, we also looked at the positive and negative, which had nothing to do with good and bad, but was about, when we're talking about existence, the positive was completion and wholeness. And this was, for Kierkegaard, bad, lower. He uses that word lower and higher, as opposed to the negative, which is becoming, and that was good for Kierkegaard, just because that was what human life is, and that's what we ought to pay attention to. So that's this second video, the metaphysics. Next video we'll look at, I want to look at the rest of those opposites, and then we'll get into some kind of the meat of Kierkegaard a little bit. I feel like now at the moment we're just building up, we're just getting into it, kind of dealing with these more abstract, more metaphysical concepts: being, non-being, possibility, actuality, the self, and so yeah. Next video we'll finish up the opposites, probably a shorter video, and then we'll get into some of the more meatier stuff. Anyway, thanks for listening as always, and I'll catch you next time.